We all know people who've met their life partner at work. Maybe you have. But with the major sexual abuse scandals over the past year, the idea of starting an office romance has become perhaps a little more fraught. If you're interested in someone at work, how would you ask them out? The office Christmas party's coming up. How can you do this, though, without it being regarded as unwanted attention, as potentially workplace sexual harassment? Karen Gately is an HR specialist and director of the human resources firm Ryan Gately. Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Now, has the Me Too movement, Karen, had much of an impact on companies as far as, their policies on office romance goes?
Yeah. Look, I think for a lot of organisations it's absolutely resulted in heightened awareness that there is risk in these areas. And, whilst we've been saying for a long time that we need to educate leaders, educate individuals around where the boundaries lie, I don't think there's necessarily been the level of investment in that's needed. So, I am seeing more organisations do that now, and I think that for a lot of people, they're really uncertain where those boundaries are, so I think that education's incredibly important.
Well, given that we do spend most of our lives at work, workplace relationships must be pretty common, yeah?
Yeah, incredibly common. I've met so many couples over the years who have met at work. They've gone on to have very successful relationships and children, families, so it can work out incredibly well for people. Obviously I've also seen the other side of that.
Mm. Well, what are the main concerns or risks from an employer's point of view?
Well, obviously, as we are seeing, there is fear around complaints being raised that I have been sexually harassed and treated, unlawfully. So, and sometimes employers fear that even if it starts off as a consensual relationship and everything's fine, that can become a problem down the track if the relationship sours. So, I think that risk of those sorts of accusations being made is the big one.
Mm. And what about if it's a relationship where there's a power imbalance, it's between a boss or a manager and a worker?
Well, I think that's where we're right in the hot spot right there, is that I think, just good leadership practice suggests that you really should not be involved with people who are your direct reports. And I think, if for whatever reason you fall in love with somebody who is your direct report, then you're going to have to make some serious choices about, what's most important to you. But I think when there is that reporting relationship, absolutely, it creates all sorts of concerns around whether or not the individual felt obligated, whether or not the individual felt that, culturally this was, the way to get ahead. So there's lots of reasons why that person could be misled or could be pressured on some levels. So again, it then creates some concerns with the rest of the staff, in terms of prejudice and favouritism and all those kinds of things. So culturally, it's highly
confidentiality,
all of that. Pillow talk is again one of those concerns. So I think it is wise for people in that situation to recognise it's just not a place you can go. Retain both your position in terms of your reporting relationship and the personal interest.
Well, Karen, have any employers tried to ban office romances?
Yes.
How's that gone?
Not very well.
Yeah.
It just means that people are sneaking around. Again, I think whilst I can understand the initial thinking around that, let's just not have the problem at all. I don't think it's pragmatic. I think if people are seriously attracted to one another and want to pursue a relationship, they'll find the way. And so I think you're entirely better off, just having policies around disclosure, for example, if there is reporting lines involved, and, encouraging people to be very professional about these things, but recognise it's going to happen.
Mm. Well, here in Life Matters, Elizabeth Shaw also joins us now. Elizabeth is the CEO of Relationships Australia for New South Wales. And hello, Elizabeth. Welcome to Life Matters too.
Hi, Amanda.
What do you see are the main concerns or risks for a person involved or thinking of getting involved in a relationship with a colleague?
Well, I think there's a number of issues. So the one that we hear about the most is the hierarchical dimension. So where the person that you're involved with, you're in a hierarchical relationship with, and all the risks and concerns that can go with that. So obviously that is difficult, and particularly for the person who's in the subordinate relationship, and we often classically see this being a female with a male boss. Then there are a lot of obvious risks there. I think also there is the danger of actually inadvertently sabotaging what is a successful work experience. So it may be that you're really enjoying the job, it's going really well, you want to build a career at least for the next little while, and adding a relationship into the mix and the dimensions of that can actually sully how you're seen and perceived. It may even sully your experience of your workplace. And so the more you load into the work experience, if it's both your work and your social life, then that can be problematic when it's not going well. But indeed, even when all of the elements are going well, because of, as Karen just mentioned, how it's perceived by colleagues and how you compromise your identity as a worker by having these other dimensions in the public view.
Yes, and yet, as Karen said too, it is going to happen. But I guess, Elizabeth, do you need to... I mean, this is hard to do when you're, in the early days of being attracted to someone because you think they're perfect. But do you need to think about things like, if it is with a colleague, if this relationship doesn't work out, am I still going to be able to work with this person? Because that's going to be the reality of it.
Look, it is. I think the difficulty, as we all know, with any romance is when is it really, something called a relationship, and when is it not? And if you met a person anywhere else, you would define that according to, the dates you've had or whatever it is. When you're seeing someone every day, when do you think you're just sort of checking each other out, and when do you say, actually, this is really going somewhere? So that's a movable feast. So I think the point you even think that you're in something, as you say, then you're caught up in the romance, and I think because you don't want to declare it until you're sure of what you're doing, and in fact the drama and the secrecy and the intrigue is part of the bond. Sometimes it heightens.
It can be thrilling.
Well, it can be very thrilling, and so sometimes you want to hold on to that privacy even for longer because it is rather delightful. But I think all of that can impair some really good decisions about what are we going to do about this. And I think too that because self-interest is running, you needn't be making the best possible decisions, because you might, not only because of the delightful privacy, but it also might be, look, we shouldn't tell people because we'll risk this or that. It's not in our interest, it's not in other people's interest, we can keep this to ourselves. That's not necessarily good decision making. It can just be justifying your preference. So I think how you make a really good decision in that context, sometimes it does need an outside perspective, and that raises the question of when do you go to others and include them in good decision making, not only to help you think straight, but also to protect yourself in the work environment.
Well, let's come back to Karen Gately, our HR specialist. Karen, should a budding relationship be disclosed to others, to management or to colleagues?
Look, I agree with all of those comments in the sense that, it can be challenging in the work environment to know, when this is serious, when it's going to go further. But I would say, the underlying success of your relationship with your employer is honesty, is being upfront. Now, I don't want to sound idealistic, because some organisations are not mature about these issues, and it may cause, real concern to the organisation. So I do think you need to use your judgment call. So long as you're keeping the relationship out of the actual workplace and work hours, then if you're pursuing that quietly to explore whether or not it's something that you want, I think that's your human right. But I do think as well that HR departments, leaders, are entirely better off creating an environment where people feel safe to be honest about how they're feeling, where they're at, and to be able to get some really good advice. I certainly know as an HR director, I had one hilarious situation where it was very clear to the entire organisation these two people were in a relationship, and I was very aware that they were deliberately hiding that from me, and they would actually sneak around, and I caught them a couple of times. And eventually I said to them, you know, there is no professional reason why this is a problem. But if it is going to change your behaviour and it is going to cause you to sneak around, then that's not great for just your relationship with the employer. So let's just be honest, let's be real. As long as there's no conflicts of interest, it's okay.
And did that make things, how did that go?
That was fantastic. We then were able to celebrate them as a couple. They're married, they've got children now. They never worked in the same department. And they were, I guess, again, incredibly professional. You know, they never had a lover's argument in the kitchen, let alone the boardroom or anything along those lines.
We might get onto this in a bit, but there are presumably some boundaries that workplace couples need to put into place too. Here in Life Matters, we're talking about the possibly perilous potential of the office romance workplace relationship. Karen Gately is an HR specialist and Elizabeth Shaw is a psychologist with Relationships Australia. And how about you? Have you dated a workmate? Were there complications because it was someone you worked with? And if so, how did you manage them? You can message us on Facebook. Karen Gately, do HR people and managers worry about workplace relationships and how to handle them?
Yes.
Is that how on the scale of things to be anxious about in the organisation you're running? Where does that come?
It's getting more common that organisations are proactively concerning themselves about those things, as we were saying earlier in the Me Too world. But I think more often than not, the alarm is raised once the situation is already there. And, so rather than having educated people and proactively dealt with, appropriate workplace conduct, so everyone understands that it's dealt with when all of a sudden there is a problem, there's a rumour that arises or there's a conflict that happens. So, again, I think, yes, organisations are more likely now to take that seriously, but it's too reactive in my view.
Right, okay. Elizabeth Shaw, if we say jumping into a few months or years into a workplace relationship, can you just talk about the thing I suggested that I suppose, that couple is probably going to need to put some boundaries on that relationship, how they enact it at work? What type of pressures does it put on you when your partner is also your colleague?
Well, look, I guess there's all the obvious things. If you're in fact peers and you've stayed in a similar role in a similar sort of team, you could end up competing for similar promotions and, so there's all of those dynamics which can actually introduce notes into your personal relationship around rivalry and so on, which, ultimately isn't very helpful. I think what's loaded on the work relationship, it can equally be said, well, what's being loaded on the personal relationship and how long can you go and be in the same workplace and still thrive in both roles. So I think there is often a point where you may need to consider that one of these roles has to change, and it may take its course that you're just ready to move on anyway, or one of you is ready to move on. I think if you're in a hierarchical relationship, resolving that is really important, particularly to consider in a very mature way that the person in the subordinate position is the most at risk in that arrangement, and it's probably just healthier for them, for one of them to get a different role. So I think there is a point where you have to say, well, we've met like this, it's gone well enough, we've managed it well, we've been mature. Our workplace, ideally, as Karen said, is a mature enough workplace to just help people deal with this. But there's a point at which perhaps being in all of these roles together is simply not going to be that healthy for you going forward.
Well, Karen, from an HR point of view, if there's a workplace couple who are not managing that well, as Elizabeth described, you might think about one of you moving to a different position or that sort of stuff. From an HR point of view, how's that best managed?
Look, I totally agree. Again, I think some people have the characteristics and the ability to separate issues and work exceptionally well together and do that over long periods of time. But for many people, creating that separation between work and home is an important aspect of maintaining the health in their own relationship. So I do think that the time comes where, you need to consider that. I do think obviously the couple need to start with understanding what's important for their individual careers and what's important for their collective futures. But, I think, again, engaging with the HR department or the appropriate leaders to have the conversation around, in large organisations, sometimes there are opportunities to still work there and be very much removed. And so if you're working closely, that might be one option. My sister works in the same organisation as her husband, and they see each other occasionally. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. But, again, having that mature conversation around one of us might need to move, and let's work in cooperation with our employer around that transition. Because, again, there's nothing wrong with saying to your employer, well, clearly one of us has to go. I'm feeling like that should be me. I want to go and find another role. And just having that open conversation around that, the employer is then able to obviously take the steps they need to make sure the role's still being looked after.
Elizabeth, what about workplace situations between not so much co-workers, but between a professional and a client? Like, for example, doctors, they're not allowed to form a relationship with patients they're treating. Again, there's a power imbalance in that relationship. But earlier this year, I'm just interested in this as a particular example. The AMA, the Australian Medical Association, received a plea to relax those rules around sexual relationships when it comes to rural doctors, because everyone they could potentially date is going to be a patient. What do you think there?
Well, look, I think further to Karen's point earlier about a workplace or a profession, in this case, banning relationships. Banning doesn't work, but what it does do is it has a strong message that, sometimes people think the strong message is important. So I think in this case, in the professions, and my own profession has looked at this, that we want to give a message around the inappropriate conduct, which is often what we're wrestling with, is when very poor decisions have been made and bring the whole profession into ill repute. That's not helpful. And you balance that with the reality that in certain contexts, and I think this can happen anywhere, where you may have multiple relationships and it's just part of how you have to live. So I think the question is less about do we ban it and more about how do we demonstrate good ethical decision making. So often people say, oh, well, it's completely different in a rural community. You can't help this or that. And I think that's it's true, and it's also can lead to sloppy decision making. So I think the duty fundamentally for anybody is facing the decision head on and saying, how can I clean this up? So for a doctor in a rural community, yes, if you've met someone and yes, you then see them at the bar later and you fall into conversation and you realise you want to pursue something, you have to say, look, I can't be your doctor. I'd like to pursue this other relationship, and you stop that relationship. So it's not about I can't help it, or because it's a small community, I've just got to do both. It's about saying, now I realise I'm in this situation, how can I as a professional demonstrate robust ethical decision making that fundamentally is in the person's interest who is most vulnerable in this relationship, whether it's my staff member or my patient.
Karen, can I just quickly ask you to finish? I started with the question of if you're interested in someone at work, how can you ask them out and it be, regarded okay? Some companies, I think, have policies like ask once but not again. Yeah, how helpful is that?
Yeah, look, I think that's the kind of education we do need to give people, the sort of guidance that, again, it's natural if you are interested. Again, don't ask while they're sitting at their desk. I think a more appropriate place is outside of the workplace. And exactly as you've just said, that kind of guidance around if the person has said no, behave respectfully and take no as a no.
Right.
They now know you are interested, and if they change their mind, they'll come and see you.
Right, all right. Karen Gately is an HR specialist, director of the human resources firm Ryan Gately, and Elizabeth Shaw is a psychologist and CEO of Relationships Australia for New South Wales. Karen and Elizabeth, thank you for your advice on this.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Amanda Smith with you.